Chapter 12. Clothingverse. I awoke with the sunlight pouring into my eyes. A warm smile further lit my world as I gazed into Felicia's eyes. "You're back," I declared. "Where did you go?" "I had things to do," she said, looking away. When she looked back, she smiled. "But I missed you, Kentaro." "I missed you too," I found myself saying. "Did you have a nice night?" I inquired. It was busy, but okay. I had to finish a few assignments and do one or two architectural jobs. Glad to be back, though. She stood up and glanced at the treehouse. "Why didn't you sleep up there?" she asked. "I don't really know. I was just enjoying the park, and then I watched the sunset. Felicia, it was so beautiful. I have never seen anything quite like it before." She grinned. "There's a perfect view of it from here, isn't there? That is why there's a gap in the tree line there," she said, pointing it out. "I knew you'd like it." I stood. My body ached a little after the arduous escape the day before. Felicia stood too, looking me up and down strangely. "Your grey clothes are so dull," she declared. "Really?" I asked, peering down at them. "Yes. Come and look for yourself in the mirror," she said, her hand grabbing mine and pulling me in the direction of the treehouse. We climbed the rope ladder, far, far up the old oak. To my surprise, and Felicia's, I was fast and nimble on the ladder, dashing up it. We emerged at the top, in front of the door, on a small, fenced balcony. I reached out for the brass handle and opened the door. It swung neatly inwards to reveal a massive room. I tentatively stepped inside to find myself bemused by just how big it was. "Why is it so much bigger than it looks outside?" I asked. "Ah, it is all down to efficient design," she explained. "It has everything, including a mirror," she said, tugging my hand toward the far side, where a mirror hung on the wall. I looked at my reflection and became more aware of myself. I smiled, shifted and moved, playfully enjoying the novelty of my own reflection. Felicia chortled, watching me. "I guess you didn't have mirrors in—" She let the question trail off, a worried look in her eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean to remind you of that place," she said softly. "It's okay," I said. "It was a horrible place, but it was also where I first met you," I added, smiling. "I used to try to see my reflection in the windows between your visits." "And what do you see now?" she asked. I stepped back a little to see my whole self. "Well, I see a someone," I said with a grin. "What, in those grey rags?" she asked. "Hey, it isn't the clothing that makes me me," I declared. "No, very true, but we can express ourselves through our clothing," she said. "I have read about such things, but I'm not sure how that works." She stepped a little closer and ran her hand through my green hair. "Your hair is so expressive. But what about these grey rags? Are they an expression of yourself?" "No," I gasped, understanding suddenly. "No, they express the world I used to be in, the life I was forced to live. I actually hate them." "Well, Kentaro, let's do something about that." And at that she turned and walked toward the front door. "Where are you going?" I asked. "You will see," she said with a grin. "Come on." I followed her back down the ladder and across the park to the station. Not long after arriving at the station, a train stopped and we got on. It was quite empty, so we sat down together, gently rocking to the sway of the train. Suddenly, our peaceful moment was interrupted by a rude woman. "Hey, you need to update your personal details," she said, holding out a clipboard and a pen. Felicia looked sternly at the woman and shook her head. "Don't tell her anything," she whispered. We both ignored her, and eventually the woman gave up and moved on to some other people. We watched as people walked past, getting on and off the train at various places. Everyone was so vibrant, their clothing so expressive, their features and bodies diverse. Even Felicia seemed entranced by watching the characters coming and going. Eventually, the train stopped at a gigantic bright station. There were rows and rows of tracks, all below a curved glass roof. As I stepped off the train, I felt the energy of the station wash over me. It was the busiest place I'd ever been to. I felt Felicia pull at my hand. "This way," she said. "Don't lose me here. It's a big place, so stay close." We scurried through the crowds of people and other beings, dashing around between and sometimes even under them. Coming to a set of barriers, she tapped her fingers on them, and they slid open to let us both pass. On the other side, a truly massive station was revealed, complete with a classic clock way above. There were creatures, beings, and peopleoids everywhere, some in groups chatting and laughing. Others were waiting on benches, and there were a few that stood alone, strangely speaking to themselves. But it soon became a blur as Felicia and I traversed the scene swiftly. She slowed and then stepped onto an escalator, which took us high above the station to another floor. When we stepped off, we were in a mall. Bright shop fronts lined each side, advertising every conceivable thing, some of which I recognized and others I didn't. Eventually, after lots more meandering, we came to a brightly coloured glass door. "What is this place?" I asked. "Welcome to Clothingverse, Kentaro," she said dramatically as we stepped through the slick doors. I looked around, but I couldn't see any clothing, just a brightly lit space. Suddenly, when we got halfway in, the walls flashed into life, with a grand display of people walking and moving in a variety of costumes. The costumes flickered and merged from colour to colour, and from style to style. I stopped, overwhelmed by the bright commercials I was surrounded by. I found myself flitting from wall to wall, unable to truly settle and engage with one advert, but completely consumed. "Don't stop, you'll be here for hours watching those adverts," Felicia said, but I was already too engrossed to reply. All I could manage was a mumbled "yeah" as I stared. Just then Felicia abruptly stood in front of me, her face pulling me out of the lush advert display. "Hey," she said, looking directly into my eyes. "Remember me?" She smiled. "Ah," I said, suddenly feeling very ashamed. "You weren't kidding when you said not to stop. It's so addictive watching those adverts." "This way," she said, her head nodding to the side. I followed her over to a door, making an effort to not get pulled back into the lush, vivid wall show around me. On the other side of the door, we arrived at a series of massive rooms. Each room had seating along one side, pointing towards a large curved wall. The rest of the room was empty, flooring covered in soft carpet. The lights dimmed to a soft yellow, and for a moment I imagined I was back in the darkness of the workhouse. Or worse, I shuddered, looking around in fear of Io arriving, or that terrifying ogre from the dungeon. It suddenly felt hard to breathe too, and I found myself gasping for breath. "Hey," Felicia said in a soft voice, putting her hand on my shoulder. "You're safe. Look at me, Kentaro. Try to take slow breaths." Her words helped to bring me back a little. Her soft, gentle eyes cut through the panic, and slowly I managed to calm myself, focusing on the fact that that world was behind me now. Just then the lights brightened, and a rather cheerful-looking old man arrived in the doorway. "Welcome to Clothingverse," he announced, "where your expression is our passion." He smiled at Felicia and then looked at me. His eyes widened and he raised an eyebrow. "Grey," he declared. "How very unusual. I like the distressing on it too. It looks very realistic." I didn't know what to say to this and was just contemplating the truth when Felicia saved me from the embarrassment. "Yes, they're good at the distressed look nowadays, aren't they? But we're here for a change," she briskly said, looking me in the eye. "Very good," the old man said, while straightening a measuring tape that hung around his neck. "Feel free to peruse our range. You won't find a better one anywhere," he announced proudly. "How would you like to browse the aisles?" "Give me voice command, please," Felicia asked. "No problem. And would you like assistance or to browse alone?" "Browsing alone would be good," Felicia declared. "Very good. Just call if you need anything," he said, bowing slightly to us both, and then he left, shutting the door behind himself. Felicia grinned at me. "So, Kentaro, what do you fancy?" she asked. I had no idea what to say. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to make sense of clothing being a choice. I just don't know. I've never been given a choice about clothing before. What have they got? I inquired. Kentaro, dear, they have everything. Everything? Surely not. No, really they do. If you can think of it, they have it, she said firmly. I don't believe that. I bet they haven't got pirate clothing, I challenged. Oh, come on, Kentaro. Of course they have. Historical or fantasy. I refused to believe Felicia, so thought I would put it to the test. Historical. Have they got Golden Age clothing from the 1600s? Oh, please, she said, rolling her eyes. Clothingverse. Give me 1600s pirate section. There was a whooshing sound, and instantly rows and rows of clothing appeared in the room, and the walls became reflective, like mirrors. We wandered down the several aisles. I was amazed by all the rich velvet garments, tricorn hats, racks of cutlasses and regalia. I reached out for a particularly beautiful red velvet coat, but my fingers passed through it. It isn't real, I declared, and there's only one size for everything. Ask for one while trying to touch it, and as for sizes, it's adaptive sizing, she said, a mischievous grin erupting on her face. Okay, I said tentatively. I reached out to touch the red one and said in a clear voice, Can I have this? Suddenly, I was adorned in the coat. I looked up to see the rich fabric flowing around me perfectly, and the golden edging sparkling. Wow, I shouted in surprise. Confused, I wondered if I was still sleeping in the park, and perhaps this was all a fantastical dream. Oh, I say, you do look dashing in that, Felicia said, suddenly arriving in front of me, dressed in equally impressive pirate gear, complete with cutlass. I stumbled back in surprise, tripping over, knocking my elbow on the way down. It hurt, or at least the pain certainly felt real, so I ruled out dreaming. I scrambled to stand, and we both chuckled. Is that real? I asked, noticing how sharp the cutlass looked. Let's find out, she replied, gesturing to a rack full of weapons. I selected a rather heavily jewel-encrusted sword and said, This, please. The sword rather abruptly appeared attached to my right side by a belt. Well, Kentaro, let's see what you got, Felicia said, drawing her sword. I drew mine too and held it out in front of me, unsure how to really use it. Take a swing at me, she said. No, I refused. I might hurt you. So you agree it's real then? I'm not so sure, but I don't want to chance it. Weapon test, please, Felicia announced, and there was a whoosh as the clothing aisles slid away and the room was filled with targets and training dummies. Thought this was just a clothing store, I asked. It is, but they also have a large stock of accessories and facilities to test them. Now, swing your sword at that straw dummy over there, she said, raising her eyebrows. Go on, you won't hurt it. I dashed over, with the excitement of being able to try the sword. Stopping in front of it, my large frame the same height, I narrowed my eyes and swung the sword with everything I had. There was a cloud of dust and straw as the blade cut through it, and then it slipped out of my sweaty hands. I rushed over to pick it up, eyeing the pristine edge in excitement. It's so sharp, I declared, excitedly bringing my finger to touch the blade. Barely touching it, to my horror, I felt it slice through the skin on my finger. Ah! I muttered as blood ran down the finger and the wound started to sting. Kentaro, Felicia said, what are you doing? Never touch the blade. She dashed over, producing a small tube of liquid, and managed to close the wound by sticking it. You're lucky it's a clean cut, but we might need to keep you away from weapons from now on. Weapon test finished, she announced, and then the room became empty again. I looked down at the red coat and over to her pirate clothing. Not sure these clothes are exactly us, I said. She touched the sword and said, I don't need this. It disappeared. Then we both did the same with our other clothing and found myself back in the grey rags. Okay, so what kind of clothing should we try next? Felicia asked. I don't know, I said. Please show us some recommendations, she commanded. There was another whoosh, followed by a massive selection of all sorts of things. She began walking down the aisles, stopping to laugh at many of the odd costumes. There was clothing from every period of history, in every colour imaginable. Halfway down an aisle I stopped, spotting a particularly over-the-top item. "This, please," I announced, turning to see it in the mirror. The garment had swirls of yellow fabric that started on my shoulders and flowed down. Upon hitting the floor, they curled around into giant features. I could suddenly barely move in its ridiculous flamboyance. "What do you think of this?" I asked Felicia. She burst into an uncontrollable laughter, followed by me. I doubled over, heaving as I laughed so much the dress catching beneath my feet and causing me to flop onto the floor in a big ball of yellow fabric. She rushed over, still wheezing in frivolity, reaching out her hand to try to get me up. But she also got caught up in the dress and fell, and we ended up tangled in each other's arms and in the dress, mere inches from one another. I found myself caught in her gaze, enchanted, in a moment that I never wanted to end. The room slipped away, everything becoming hazy around me, all except her. She leant in, and for a tiny moment, her lips touched my cheek in a kiss. Then she rolled off and stood up, but there I remained, lost in what had just happened. That tiny moment, that tiny gesture, left me changed. I could still feel her lips on my cheek, my heart racing, a blaze of elation, and my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I was trying to understand. I brought my hand to my cheek to touch the place where she had kissed it. Looking up, I saw her gentle smile and clambered to my feet. We laughed our way through the day as we tried on so many clothes, from the absurd to the stiflingly boring. As we explored how they made us feel and look, we imagined the type of person that might wear them, putting on voices to imitate them, which just made us laugh all the more. I felt strangely contented, and the horrors of my old life finally seemed further away than they had ever been. I was totally at ease, drifting through the endless, blissful day, cherishing every moment with Felicia. It had been the longest I had ever spent with her yet, though she was someone I would never tire of being with. We brought out the best in each other, and time passed so quickly when we were together. But then I found myself wondering if it would last. We left the Clothingverse late afternoon, with so many bags of clothes that we had to use 6 seats on the train home. I sat, admiring my rich orange shirt and baggy trousers in the window reflection. Strangely, I did feel more me now, on the outside that was. It felt good to not be wearing the grey reminders of the workhouse any more. When I had gone to leave, they had put them in a bag, but I asked for them to be discarded. When I saw them drop into that bin, I felt like the last piece of my old life had been let go of. I felt like I was finally ready to accept my new life. I realized that Felicia had been right. The clothing we wear can be an extension of ourselves. I glanced at the plump bags filled with an eclectic mix of clothes, mostly for me, but some for her too, and I grinned. Dashing up to the treehouse, we put the clothing down and decided to catch the sunset together. We sat holding hands, the perfect end to a perfect day. I never thought it was possible to feel so happy, to be so very happy, but having my own freedom and spending time with Felicia had proved me wrong. I wished that day and that moment would never end, but sadly, the bitter fact of life is that nothing lasts forever, no matter how dearly beautiful or truly pure it is. All moments must fade, and as the first stars came out in the inky sky, I heard the cruel buzz from her wrist. She stood to leave, but just before she turned, she kissed me on the cheek. "I'll be back soon, my dear Kentaro," she said, and then she was gone.